Hi, my name is Sandy Baird, and I'm here with the Cuban American Friendship Society to report on our recent trip to Cuba, where we were for about a week, taking some teachers to Cuba to look at their educational system, to compare our educational system with theirs, and also just to visit the island and the people there. As I said, my name is Sandy Baird, and I've been going to Cuba since 1981. And then in the 90s, I established a group called the Cuban American Friendship Society because I wanted to extend friendship to the Cuban people. Since 1959 until the present, our government has not been such a friend to Cuba, and in fact has been seen Cuba and its people as adversaries, have made life very difficult for the Cuban people in terms of trade and credit. And in fact, the Cubans say that there is a blockade against the Cuban people and against the island by the United States. So, in my heart of hearts, I wanted to extend friendship to the people of Cuba, who have always been warm, hospitable, and great friends of us here in the United States. So I have other people with me who were on that trip. I have the president of the Cuban American Friendship Society, Armando Villaseca, who is also our Secretary of Education in Montpelier for a number of years, and also Al, our teacher buddy, who came with us to Cuba for his first time, right? And Eric Añero, who also was with us, and we are going to talk about our impressions of what's going on in Cuba today. Okay, so take it away, I guess. Armando, what did you think?
But Sandy, before we start, we will have like a video that is in progress. We're not done yet, but it will give an idea of what we saw over there.
Sorry. The rebellious island.
So rebellious.
Okay. Do we have it? It's always so thrilling when they say, "Welcome to Havana."
If you want to know, you have to go. If you want to learn what it's like somewhere, you need to go there. You're not going to get that experience from reading it in a book and an article online. True. You need to go, you need to walk the streets, you need to meet the people, you need to be in their schools and see what it actually truly is like. That is how
you need to hear their story. If I'm just reading about Cuba in an American book or an American news story, I'm hearing the American perspective on the Cuban story. Mm-hmm. But if I come to Cuba, I begin to understand the Cuban story from their perspective. The question was, whose story do you not hear? Well, I don't hear the Cuban story unless I come.
That one is the Ministry of Telecommunication building. It's a very famous plaza.
Voilà.
Okay, so I'll begin the conversation with talking to Armando Villaseca, who also was born in Cuba, came here when he was a very young boy, and then has gone back over the years, and I've also seen Cuba after he left. Was one of those Cubans who went back with an open mind, right? So what were your findings, Armando?
Well, I mean, Sandy, I've been going back to Cuba now, both with CAFS and prior to CAFS since 1999, right at the end of the special period. And for those who don't know, the special period was the 10 years following the fall of the Soviet Empire, where Cuba lost a lot of their income. But just talking...
Were you there during the special period?
Just at the very end.
Yeah,
and
right.
I think that was no longer maybe the special period anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, with CAFS, we've been bringing groups to Cuba for the past 15 years. We just have another group going in a couple of weeks, plus the group that just went. We work with Vermont Law School. We work with many organizations and have seen Cuba evolve.
All right.
And the best years, to cut it short, were the Obama
Right,
years.
of course, yeah.
When President Obama was opening up the number one tourism, increased trade, educational activities, exchanges. There was a lot more exchange going on. The Cubans saw that as the beginning of the future. They love Obama. If anybody
Obviously.
Obama spoke to the people of Cuba live on TV, uncensored, which is unheard of. And he was, again, he was the hope. And then unfortunately, we had President Trump who came in and changed everything and made things considerably worse for the Cubans, including his final act, which was placing Cuba on the terrorist watch, state-sponsored terrorist watch list, which denies Cuba all kinds of opportunities for financial investments, for trade with other countries. And right now, Cuba is a mess. People are food is in shortages, inflation is really high. It doesn't impact us. You just saw that pretty video with girls dancing and all this other stuff. But if you're a Cuban and you're making 3,000 to 4,000 pesos a month, which is the average salary, and 30 eggs cost you 1,600 pesos, that's a third of your salary just for eggs. So for us as Americans, which is very helpful to Cuba when we go, because we're supporting the economy. Alan and the teachers stayed at private homes. We only eat at private restaurants. We take private cabs whenever possible. So we try to do everything where the money goes directly to the people and not to the government. Obviously, there are times you can't avoid it, but that's our goal. And as an organization, our goal is one of bring friendship, support, trying to change people's hope, trying to change people's minds here. Senator Leahy was an incredible supporter of Cuba.
Right.
Senator Welch is also a huge supporter of Cuba. I'm sure new Representative Ballin will also become a big supporter of Cuba.
We better talk to her. We don't know.
We have to talk to her. And Senator Sanders, of course, is also a supporter of changing the policy we have towards Cuba. And that's really where I see it, where things right now have gotten worse over the years. But there's hope as the Cuban government and the U.S. government have more discussions that are underway to allow for more normalization of our two countries.
Well, I wanted to ask you what you thought too, but before, I just want to mention a few things of why the United States has been harsh on Cuba, at least in my opinion. Maybe we would have some discussion about that. But in 1959, Fidel Castro came into Havana and changed Cuba during what the Cubans call, and what historians will call as the Cuban Revolution, and established a socialist government in Cuba, a government with hopes that it would eventually be also a communist government. And the United States, because of its attitudes toward all of Latin America, but particularly toward Cuba, which became, and not with treaties, an ally of the Soviet Union, but Cuba played into the Cold War, of course, by becoming very friendly with the Soviet Union. And so the United States, since that point, has said we will try essentially for regime change in Cuba, that we really don't want a socialist or a communist government 90 miles from Florida. So since that time, the United States has established first an embargo and what the Cubans call a blockade against the Cuban government. Many Americans also probably would not agree with the Cuban government either. However, this blockade has acted harshly and with a great deal of cruelty toward the Cuban people, the very people that we should be, in my mind, trying to help because they're neighbors and friends. So that, I think, is the reason, unless other people have other ideas about it.
I want to hear from,
anyway, so Al, how did you find Cuba? This was your first visit, right?
First visit.
You're a teacher where?
I'm a special educator at the Burlington High School.
Okay.
And I've been privileged to travel quite a bit all around the world, and Cuba was one of those places that I never really thought I'd get to. And when the opportunity presented itself through the Burlington School District, I jumped at the chance to head on down. And I read up on Cuba. I learned as much as I could. You know, the history is sad and fascinating. I mean, it's really been kind of bandied about with the colonial powers and everything, and unfortunately, a lot of that hasn't really changed. I got down there and my mind was blown, honestly. I wasn't I wasn't sure what to quite expect. And it was impressive and sad and amazing and awful, all kind of rolled up into one. It was.
You visited
I'm
the
still
schools.
processing it all. Honestly.
Yeah, well, really, why?
It's just so different. There's not a ton of stores on every street. It's
No
the first-
stores.
Yeah, it's the first time I've gone to a country and not had a chance to check out what the inside of a grocery store looks like. So it was very different from past travel experiences. Going to all of the different schools, and we had the opportunity to visit elementary schools, middle schools, high school, and other things as well. But in all of them, I had kind of in my head certain expectations, and
Like?
I thought that I would be seeing a ton of kids crammed into classrooms, which was kind of the case.
Yeah?
But the behaviors of the students were incredible. I can honestly say, as an educator who's taught for almost 20 years in the American system, you're kind of used to some of that more individualistic kind of take on school, and sometimes you get some behaviors that really flare up. I didn't see any of that there. And to that point, I actually asked our guide at one point, is this just kind of a show because the American teachers are here? And she said, no, this is a cultural expectation. You go to school to learn. You don't act up in class. You respect the teachers. And I thought, this is where we as Americans could learn from our Cuban counterparts. So it was overall a fantastic trip. I would make the journey back to Cuba because I really just got a taste of it.
So but you said there were some awful parts too, right?
Well, certainly you see some folks on the streets, and you have to wonder where they're getting help. Our guide told me at one point, I became pretty close with her, that she makes about 4,000 Cuban pesos a month, which you mentioned, but to our audience out there, that's about $24 US a month. Right. So you hear those kinds of statistics, and you're like, how the heck do you live? I think when we left, toilet paper was like about $3 US per roll. And you just have to wonder, how do these people put food on the table and have the other basic amenities that you need?
Toilet paper was sold on the black market, or is being sold on the black market.
So that was one of but I will say that overall, like, the spirit of the people is what would draw me back to Cuba. We really met a lot of amazing folks. They were curious about the Americans that were visiting. They were super sweet, super nice. So
They really like us to be there, don't they?
they do.
Yeah.
I think, and I mean,
It takes a bit of an effort, and they know it.
it does. And let's not mince words. They're there to, they probably like seeing our tourist dollars to some degree as well. But
Of course.
I thought that they were very authentically engaging and very nice. And I loved the Paladeras. Is that
The Paladares, the private
the
restaurants.
little private restaurants were wonderful.
They look like regular restaurants, but they run all, they're
totally
separate from the
family-
family, or
Family-owned, right?
So that was great.
Yep.
So that was another experience. Like, a lot of these little private, smaller, family, kind of almost like in a family's home.
Yeah.
Feeding us American, teachers and other folks was pretty interesting. So, and very different again from.
Did you think of it as a poor country with a lot of poverty, or what was it? Maybe you could comment on that, Eric, as well. But let's hear from Mel.
Again, I only got to see some sections of Havana. I didn't get a chance to go out and really
Better
see
parts.
I didn't get to see other
You weren't
parts.
in Centro. Where is it?
They went through Central, but Central's not bad compared to the outer
Yeah.
places
We
in
stayed in
Havana.
the nice area. We stayed kind of
Yeah.
on Embassy Row. So
yeah.
I don't think I'm really probably the one to maybe speak to that. I do think we did see poverty. We saw folks that were out asking for money, but we weren't able to venture too far outside of Havana either. So I don't have any kind of I don't know what it looks like in the rural parts or even in the other cities. So, but I would say poverty seems like it's pretty prevalent.
The thing with poverty in Cuba is that everybody's poor. So that's and when I say poor, I don't mean poor as in that they're starving, because really most people aren't starving in Cuba.
Even now, you don't think so?
Even now, what we have seen for the first time ever was street people. I'd never
Yeah.
seen street people before.
You mean living on the street?
Living on the street, sleeping on the street. I'd never seen that before, because the communist government always would institutionalize them or put them someplace. But that, the
I
government
didn't-
itself.
Really, you saw that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, now you see it. I saw more than ever before. But the thing with Cuba is that, for example, they still have a ration coupon book. So every Cuban gets, like 2 pounds of rice, a pound of sugar per month, a little bit, certain amount of meat, which is only supplements their ability for food. And even that isn't enough. And that right now, if you can believe it, Cuba, which was a sugar-producing country, one of the top in the world, is now importing sugar from France, because the sugar production has dropped dramatically because they've closed. It's a whole long story,
Yeah,
but basically,
right.
it's what it is. It's the incompetent communist government that causes all of this, on top of the fact that they have an embargo that's killing them. So the Cubans will say we have the external blockade, which is the U.S., and then we have the internal blockade, which is the government, which is very centralized and tries not to allow. So decisions are made up here that have no relation to what's actually happening on the ground. So a lot of times bad decisions are made. So there's enough blame to go around, and a lot of the blame lies with Cuban Americans in this country.
Why?
Because they have a lot of power and are able to influence politicians in Washington to continue to vote against anything with Cuba. Why is it that we still have a system in place for over 60 years that's obviously a failed system? One little country that has no authority to hurt anyone, no ability to hurt anybody else.
It's certainly not a terrorist country.
Not a terrorist country.
Right.
And if it was a true embargo like what we did with apartheid in South Africa, every country in the world, this is only Cuba. And the only 2 countries that vote to continue to keep this at the UN is the US and Israel. Interesting enough, Israel votes with that way, but they trade heavily with Cuba. And actually, I just saw some Israeli visitors when I was there last time. So we're the only country that is punishing this poor little country because people like Senator Menendez from New Jersey, who's a Cuban Democrat, but goes along with Marco Rubio, a right-wing Republican, on only one thing: keeping the embargo on Cuba. And initially was get rid of Castro. Well, Castro died. Then get rid of his brother. Well, his brother left. Now they want...
Left, he's still alive though, yeah?
He's still alive, but he's theoretically not running.
No, I know. He accepted term limits in a way.
But he still runs things.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
still... And that's the other problem. That Cuba has, all these 85-plus-year-old men who are still reliving the revolution of 1959.
Is that true of the current president, Canal Diaz, you think?
I
Was
think
he part of the revolution?
He's young, but
Yeah.
I think, the people in charge, these politicians who are former military, who are now in their 80s and are still looking at the world through the lens of 1960, not 20. Which is why why 2% of the population has left in the past year. And thank God. That now we're doing something to try to help it by allowing 20,000 Cubans to come every month through a parole system that the president has initiated. And it's not just with Cuba, Sandy. It's with Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba.
Right.
We have Graham. Graham, are you with us? Hello, Graham? Could you mute
Somebody's
yourself?
on mute. Oh, he's in the bottom.
Is it bar?
No, he's at the bottom, I think.
Yeah. Can we hear him?
Graham?
Yes, hi.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Hey, did you want to say something?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, here's my observation following the World Baseball Classic. So I went down in May and last month, and about every couple of days I'll just throw it into Google, like Cuba news. And the latest Cuba news was all about the baseball game. But it wasn't about Cuba. It was about freedom of the press. Well, in the United States, all the press is free to report the same story that the State Department would kind of have you enjoy. And in Cuba, it's, freedom of the press doesn't really exist
At all.
in the way that we understand. But
we lost him.
We lost him.
Lost him?
Yeah, we lost him.
We lost him.
talking about freedom of the press, yeah, I'm quite surprised. I mean, I wasn't surprised because the revolution wouldn't last that long if there was a freedom of speech. But concerning Cuba, it's always important to talk about Cuba vis-à-vis the position of the U.S. and the extreme violence with which, the U.S. and its allies that are complying with this blockade, force Cuba to be in that position. I really wanted to see if Cuba would be like this if there wasn't that embargo, and then I will turn to Armando to try to answer this question. Is it only about the embargo, or there are causes that are intersect to
Well,
Cuba?
I mean, I think that part of the issue is that the Cubans in Miami, who are the ones demonstrating before the Miami and before the Cuba-U.S. game, are the people who are, many of those were in power prior, not them, but people in power like them. So when you look at the Miami Cubans, I'm going to use them as sort of a generality, they want to repress, they want to repress Cuba, they want to repress speech because they want only their position. So they're just as bad as the government on the island, who represses the rights of people, as they've jailed many artists in the past year. But I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but the goal that everybody had when Batista was overthrown by Castro, including my family and others who were supportive, was that it would eventually become a democracy of some sort, whatever democracy means. They never thought that it would turn into a dictatorship, is what it was, a communist dictatorship that never had a chance to become what everybody was expecting. They did a lot of good things around education, healthcare, but at what cost? And was it as a result of the U.S. embargo or the U.S. position? Maybe. Was it part of the greed and the selfishness of people in power to maintain control and control? There's probably a combination of those things. But Cuba is where it is today by its own doing as well as by the U.S. There's a common enough to go around. We have different positions. I grew up in a Cuban community that even what I'm talking about right now would not be allowed. Would not be allowed. I would be considered a communist.
Right.
And what I am as a realist is that there's enough blame to go around.
I am too, and I've always been. Well, I'm surprised recently that there have been so many protests in Cuba, and I believe it is because the revolutionary government of the Castros is gone, and there's now another new president who probably has not the charisma nor the attractiveness that the Castros had in the first place. But also, I thought that the situation, at least economically, seemed really much worse, and that I certainly have always thought people have the right to protest, and so I support those protests.
I think you're absolutely right, and that blame is on the U.S. I think that the fact that the economy is as bad as it is is a direct result of our.
But not only is it also is something the U.S. seems to want. They want to starve these people, the Cuban people. That's what I don't understand.
No, it seems
now,
cruel.
Look, I don't support. It's not my government, so I'm not.
Cruelty that
It is. To me, it's a crime against humanity. I don't see any reason that helps anybody. Sure. It's not going to overthrow that government. Never.
And speaking with Lorraine from our guide down there, she said that protesting comes at a real cost if you are caught.
Yes.
It's like an automatic 10 years with no chance of parole. So, these things that we take for granted here, maybe in the U.S.
Well, I wonder now.
Yeah.
Well, you're right. People can get, and particularly young people. Some of and again, right now, the Vatican, actually, the U.S. and a couple of other countries have really been appealing to the government.
Too?
The U.S. to release the J16, the kids that were arrested and given 10-year terms of prison for 19, 20-year-olds for demonstrating. These are on the arts demonstration where the government has now passed laws that things have to be approved by then. Art has to be approved by the government before it can be.
And that it was relatively, it always has been censored, but not like this.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I believe in everybody's right to protest against their own government, but I don't love the support either that the U.S. gives to many of those protests as well. And I just wish Cuba well, and my government is what I'm targeting. It's my government. They have to lift these terrible sanctions. And it's not only against Cuba, although I think the sanctions against Cuba and the embargo and blockade are the longest against Cuba of anywhere. In this island that's 90 miles away, in hopes that there would be regime change. And of course, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen, I don't think. But anyway.
But like, if I can go back to the educational side
Yeah.
of things, like you see the resilience of like the Cuban people with just how successful they've been with their education. I can remember some of the statistics when we went and visited schools where after the first year after Fidel took power, something like 25% of the people in Cuba were illiterate.
Higher. It was higher than that.
Yeah.
25, 26%. Anyway, and then after a year, because Fidel said, no, we're going to have these folks educated. They are going to learn how to read. And a year later, you have a population that is under 1%?
Yeah, I think that it eventually got that way. But you're talking about the literacy campaign.
Yes, right,
See,
right,
So
right.
successful.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty amazing.
I always thought, when I was first in Cuba, there were signs all over the place that said 6, meaning they wanted to get to 6th grade level. 2 years later, I went back, was 9,
Yeah.
9th grade, and now it's close to 100% literacy, isn't it?
Yep.
And I've always thought that that was one thing. When you teach people how to read and write, they're not going to be slaves anymore,
Yeah.
you know? But anyway, so...
But the education is one of those areas that
Yeah.
Cuba is very,
Very
proud
successful,
of.
yeah.
And again, the problem is you have this educated population that sees no
I know,
future.
right,
And
I
that's
know.
and that's the piece that the government quite hasn't figured out. And part of it they can't figure out because they have an embargo that doesn't allow them to do certain things. At the same time, trying to maintain control is also their sort of Achilles heel on the island about how, why don't they just allow the people, like what they try to do is to have a Chinese or Vietnamese economic model with
Right.
with the current government. So you can have a communist government, single party, but you could still have the economy that's going to be humming along. Cuba has chosen, and they've been recommended to do that by China and Vietnam and others,
Yeah.
but they've chosen not to do it. They still want to maintain that centralized. In order for that to happen, you have to let go and let people go
So
off.
you think that they then don't have any private enterprise?
They have private enterprise.
some.
No, they
Small,
have
right?
Yeah, small. They have now small, medium, and large, but they're very limited in what they can do. They're
Limited
still-
to the employees they can hire too.
Limited to the
Yeah.
number of employees they can hire. Limited to, if you want to have a farm, I still have to sell you at the government price, even though it might cost me more. So people stop selling it or stop growing things. So again, the issue is let the economy sort of grow as a natural economy of people making things, selling things on their own, not being forced to give 75% of their
Yeah.
crops to the government. But again, that's all part of a growing process for the Cuban government because they've been, under a system that has been very, very centralized, and these are growing pains. And instead of us being there to help them with these growing pains, we keep kicking sand in their face. So it's really, it's a tragedy.
Yeah, it is. So you asked about freedom of the press, right?
Yeah, freedom of the press, but also, like coming from Africa, I look at Cuba differently than, people from the US because, my country, for example, the Ivory
d'Ivoire,
Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, is the best, students from the IMF, the World Bank. We have like all the buildings and fancy things, but 40% of the population doesn't know how to read and write. People still live with like $1 or $2 per day, but they can work in huge, French-owned supermarkets, American-owned businesses. Nothing belongs to them. But, they have the best numbers when it comes to, economics, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or, and no real political freedom. Most of the countries in West Africa that are under the influence of France have the leaders chosen by Paris. at some point you ask yourself, okay, what do I sacrifice for just to have some toilet paper, or or not? I'm still hopeful that as the U.S. influence is diminishing across the planet, that
yeah.
other powers are emerging, maybe there will be less a burden on Cuba coming from Washington, so we can see at least what the model of Cuba can produce, because it's like une symphonie inachevée, like we say in French, a symphony that is not achieved, did not go to the end. So I really would like to see Cuba free of that major blockade and see how it will go. But I also would like to see the Cuban government put some water in their wine, as we say, because you can't live isolated. You live in a world with like the villains, with those who are against you, and you try to maneuver. So it's difficult. If you go, for example, with China, China has the means to do what they do. China is a communist country.
Well, yeah.
They do business,
Yeah.
but
do big
because
business.
the U.S. cannot go there and dictate whatever they want, China is successful. But imagine if China was crippled by the West.
Can't be. It's too big.
It's too big.
Right.
Cuba is small, and Cuba is like facing, a huge amount of hostility from Washington, from other European countries. So they did what they could with what they had. It's not perfect, because even here, I heard that the literacy rate is going down.
Here, yeah.
People in the mightiest country, my daughter has to pay $65,000 for a semester or a year to go to college.
Yeah.
While anybody in Cuba can go to college. As soon as you're done with high school, you have a place that is waiting for you in college. It's also the opportunity to ask, what makes you happy?
Yeah.
We saw people, it's tough. It's very, very tough over there, but we still see people that are trying to.
Yes. That's the spirit part that I was talking about, where it's like these people have nothing compared to us.
This was at the Ludwig Foundation, but let's
Oh, nice.
let's go back to our discussion. So what's next for Cuba?
I'm worried about Cuba for the first time. Anyway, what do you think? What do you guys think? The reason I'm worried is that I see, I've been there since 1981, and this was the second time last May also, that I saw real hardship. Even in 81, when the Soviets were there, with all the problems probably that the Soviets brought to Cuba, there was always enough to eat, there was always good schools, good healthcare system, and so forth. This time I heard also talk of real hunger. Didn't you? Or,
Yes.
Lorraine, our guide, said that she didn't, frankly, get enough to eat, and she even has access to money.
Yeah.
That is worrisome to me. And I'm not certain that the government has the loyalty that the Castros had. And there was a lot of criticism of the government. There was a lot of criticism also that crime was increasing. Did you heard that? Mm-hmm. And that's unheard of in Cuba. That was simply unheard of when I been there before. So I'm.
But the world is in crisis.
Wait, I know.
The world is in crisis.
Agree. And there's one
even here in the U.S.
No kidding.
I mean, there are people who can't eat here.
I know. And there, you know what else we have here that is probably not as true in Cuba? We have a whole massive incarceration rate, too, of people in prison. We have a lot of. I'm not certain the United States is going to survive this.
You go to Europe.
Cuba.
I was in Europe recently. Europe is like
a mess.
It's not working. There's an international crisis. So small feathers like light feathers like Cuba will feel it, but Europe is feeling that crisis as well. Mm-hmm. But Europe has like centuries of exploitation of the third world.
I know,
So
I agree.
cash and reserves of gold that were taken from
Venezuela,
so
even.
so they have it. I mean, less difficult than the countries. If you go to Africa, you see all these big investments from international companies and corporates. Nothing belongs to the people over there. So what is it? You give everything, all your resources. The Congolese are dying. They're sitting on, gold, manganese, all these resources, and they're dying every day. 700,000 people died in Iraq just
Having a
because
war, I know.
we wanted to, topple down Saddam Hussein. It's not a world that is fair. It's not fair
Right.
for Cuba as well.
No, but the fact is that Cuba is part of that developing world that has been crushed by colonial powers, especially by its colonial imperial power, by the United States. That's interesting because with everything we're saying about the demise of Cuba or not, and the demise of the United States as not, as the United States loses power, perhaps the colonial world and will rise. Who knows? But I don't like the idea necessarily of the demise of my own country either. But
I think I'm going to give a little credit to the Cuban people.
Yeah,
just
right,
on the
exactly.
history I've read about them, like these are people that have been pushed around since Columbus first got there, and they're still here today. They've been pushed around. They've been punched in the gut, so to speak, by many different European powers, and yet they're still here. They have a lot of tough things ahead of them right now.
Yeah.
But they've weathered this stuff before as a people. I would be more concerned about like the United States or something where
I
they
am
really
concerned.
haven't had to weather something that's lasted for, say, something as long as like an embargo that's in its 62nd
Mm-hmm.
year or whatever. And yet the Cuban people push on. I mean, they somehow get through it.
Well-
so I'm not
Yeah.
diminishing what they are going through. And certainly we met a lot of people that are going through a tough time there. But the ones I met at least were doing it with a smile on their face, and they were getting,
yeah,
I don't know.
they smile a lot more than we do.
I just felt like I saw a lot of happy people that, compared to their U.S. counterparts, seemed a lot happier. And, and we have a lot more than the Cuban people, so to speak. So
What
I'm not sure why that is, but again, I think it's just built into that history where they've been pushed around and they've just developed this resilience and reliance upon themselves to get through it.
This is what's the most worrisome to me is that a lot of people want to leave. A lot. And that as young people with skills,
Sure.
and they are, because of the Cold War mentality of the United States, the Cubans are also welcome here.
Sandy, you know what?
What?
Cote
Well, wait a
d'Ivoire.
minute, yeah.
Cote d'Ivoire is the best student
all
from
wanna
the island.
leave
But
too.
you know what?
They all-
Everybody wants to leave.
Of course, I know. They all, right.
Most of the kids that are dying, in the oceans trying to reach
Europe.
the European shores are from Ivory Coast, from
Ivory
Cote
Coast?
d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire is the locomotive of the economy in West Africa. Yet the people don't get the proceeds from what the country sells. Cacao. Cote d'Ivoire is #1 producer of cacao. But how many Ivorians can have the luxury to eat some chocolate in their life? So the whole system has to come to. We need to find a middle ground, not the extreme of maybe a socialist revolution that will anyway face the resistance of either the people themselves or the countries that abhor socialism. Look, even the senator from Vermont, as soon as he says he's a socialist, people want to put him in jail. I don't know. So we have to find a middle ground.
Because people don't know the difference between socialism and communism.
Communism.
No, but Bernie got really hammered because he said something decent about Cuba specifically, didn't he?
Yeah.
I can't even remember what it
All the
was.
way to Moscow.
Right.
He went to Moscow on his
terrible.
honeymoon.
Yeah. Do you think that Leahy went to Cuba not knowing that maybe the system is a little bit extreme, but Leahy learned a lot from Cuba
Yeah.
and brought it here. So
And
maybe we can meet halfway.
He didn't get punished about it either. Leahy never was.
Well, because he lives in Vermont. If he was in Florida,
but
he lives in Florida, he wouldn't have been senator. I mean, that's
Yeah,
the difference.
yeah,
Is It's easy when we live in Vermont to be able to be liberal and to say these things. If you were a
and Leahy
senator,
was not running for president.
and he wasn't running for president, but also
Right.
he wasn't running for senator in Florida
Yeah.
or in New Jersey. But again, I think that Senator Leahy did a lot of things. He
Yeah.
helped with Alan Gross. He was the one that helped get Alan Gross. He was a prisoner. I'm not going to get into it. Held by the Cubans, and they were exchanged for the Cuban Five.
Right.
And he was very much involved with
Yes,
that. So
right,
he's very much
right.
Leahy's been very much a player in this. So when he left, besides Vermont losing all kinds of influence in Washington, it was a big influence with Cuba. And what happens with Cuba is up to the Cubans, really, because everything that happened. You talk about all these countries. Yes, the Europeans, went to Cuba, but there were Cubans themselves who worked with all the foreigners and still do. In 1959, Batista, by that point, he was working with the Americans. So the wealthy are still working with these corporations.
Except the Castros didn't.
Except Castro didn't, because he kicked them all out.
Yeah, right.
And again, was it the right thing to do? I obviously think it was the wrong thing to do. He could have come up with a way that didn't require nationalizing everybody's property. I don't care where you are. If you're in the U.S., they nationalize my property. You kidding me? You're going to take my house? You're going to take my property? No. Of course people reacted badly to it. He was dissed by the Americans. He was dissed by Kennedy. He was dissed by Eisenhower. When he came to the U.S., he ended up having to stay in Harlem because the hotel in Manhattan.
But that made him a hero.
It made him a hero.
It made him
of
a
course,
hero.
Of course.
I remember that.
All I'm saying is that he was dissed. You could
Yeah.
see where you're a young revolutionary and you think that, you're hot shit and that you're going to, all of a sudden these people are dissing you, you're going to go back, then the Russians are offering you financial support,
Well, did they? I mean, they traded a lot with Cuba.
Oh my God, they supported Cuba.
Yeah, right. And that's why the special period
Right.
was
It wasn't
really-
just Russia, it was the whole Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, yeah,
It was
yeah.
all of the, Eastern Europeans as well. But nevertheless,
But the European powers have never had an embargo against Cuba. It's only the United States,
But
right?
the
Yes.
United States doesn't allow the European to do freely business with
Right.
Cuba.
Right,
That's right,
because
that's
because it's a blockade. It's
Right.
not just an embargo. It
Right.
extends to third countries.
Right,
So it makes
right,
it into
right,
a blockade.
right.
But it's also true that the United States has always had a special interest in controlling all of Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right now, for instance, our relationships with Venezuela are really broken because we perceive the leader of Venezuela to be a socialist also, right?
yeah, but that goes back to Chavez days.
Yeah, I
That goes
know,
way
I know,
back.
I know. Well, now, not as far back as Cuba, though.
Not as far back as Cuba, because again, Venezuela's government was a corrupt mess before that. Not that Chavez did anything bad or good. He was something different. He gave money to the people. He spent a lot of the oil revenues to give money to the people, not in a smart way. There wasn't investments for them people to make money in the future. So he was very popular. The guy now doesn't have the charisma. that
Right,
Chavez had.
Maduro, yeah.
Doesn't have the charisma, and
We did the same thing to Haiti, too, the United States. When it had its revolution in 1804, it was the same kind of embargo and blockade of Haiti because it had overthrown a white French government in favor of a black government.
and the French charged
and
them.
the French charged them a debt on the slaves' bodies.
Same thing for the 14 or 15 countries that have to use a currency that is like we call it monkey's money, controlled by the Bank of France. France, when France was obliged because everybody in the world was liberating the peoples and the countries that were under colonization, France has to give a pseudo independence to these countries, but with strings attached. Like our countries sign like documents that are that give France preference on the resources. France has to say, okay, I'm not interested for another country to come. 60% of our, the hard currency, the foreign currency that we get, dollars, euros, we are obliged to put that in the Bank of France for France to give us that phony money that we can only use among ourselves. So, I mean, yet, Ivorians have nice bridges, they have supermarkets that, brings like things that, are forbidden in Europe to the Ivory Coast. So how much do you give to the superpowers to have a toilet paper?
Right.
But again, when bringing this back to Cuba, it's again, there's enough blame to go around, but ultimately the government itself, internal government, how they manage the embargo. Okay, you got an embargo. Yeah. That's life. How do you manage it internally is the issue that I think has to be addressed. We can take away the embargo. If the internal operations don't change, things aren't going to get that much better.
But I think what Eric was asking is a question I would ask. Do you think, this is totally speculation, I would guess if the embargo were lifted that the Cuban government would have to change in a way.
The Cuban government would change because it would no longer,
it would no longer
blame.
be able to say it's Washington.
And it's not prevalent anymore, but up until probably about 10 years ago, if you drove around the city, around the countryside, you'd see billboards.
Yeah.
Huge billboards blaming the U.S. It would be Bush, holding a gun to Cuba. It would be, really.
It wasn't Obama.
No, it wasn't Obama. And then it was during Obama they started taking all those down. So, if you take away, as the Cubans say, if you take away the embargo, the government's going to change because they can no longer blame.
The U.S.
Right.
And then there will be enough wealth. If the model stays, there will be.
I'm worried about somebody taking full advantage of the Cuban people at that point too. I would be worried about. So I was thinking about this when I was down there. We saw a lot of beautiful older cars, and at one point somebody said that those cars. I rode around for half a day in a 1957 Ford Fairlane. Beautiful car.
I had one.
So fun.
Yeah, right.
And all I could think of was,
I had
if
one
things were to
now.
open up, what's to prevent America?
Buying cars.
I
buying
said,
thousands of cars.
what's to stop Jay Leno? I brought him up because he's kind of a famous car aficionado.
Yeah.
From going down there with a huge boat and saying, I'm going to help the Cuban people out, and instead of paying $1,000 for one of these beautiful old restored cars, I'll give them $2,000.
Yeah, but so what?
But they'll last for 20 because they're expensive. But even 20
I'm just saying,
for Jay Leno.
he gets to go down there and just fleece all these beautiful cars for next to nothing.
Or
off
the
of the Cuban
properties,
people.
or some of the old houses.
Some of the beautiful old houses.
Yeah.
So,
But that's their business.
well,
Isn't it?
I think so, but I'm just worried that
Well, of
they'll
course,
get taken full advantage of.
I wouldn't want Cuba also to have a bunch of, even though I like McDonald's kind of, I don't want Cuba to have a bunch of McDonald's or
But
Starbucks.
the Russians have their own,
I know.
let the people do what they want to do,
yeah.
and then let's see. And then we'll see that government, we can judge
What
that government.
what the government has to do is, and I think that what Alan you're talking about is something that I fear is that maybe it's not cars, but it's corporations coming in and buying.
Sure, that's going to happen.
People buying real estate at prices
Right.
and
The
pushing
Cuban will be the first to rebel and then to be unhappy about big corporates coming.
They wouldn't rebel
saw
because
it
they
in
haven't
my
rebelled
country.
now.
I see it around the the
yeah, but what
walls
did
that
they
is.
do about
they
it? What
rebel?
can they do about it?
What can they do?
Nothing.
So
they didn't rebel now when the things are worse. Things are bad. I think that the government itself has to have, how much ownership. It has to be 51% Cuban ownership. It has. There
That's
has
what
to be
the Chinese did, right?
Well, that's what they did when I was in the Middle East. Same thing. But whatever it is, it can't be a free for all. Just because I have the money, I can buy everything. There has to be some limits as to what you can buy, how much you can buy.
Can you imagine if somebody was able to go in unfettered and buy up all the real estate next to the
my God.
Malecon?
Oh yeah.
You'd have another Miami.
And people
where
would sell it.
You have these gigantic resorts blocking out the view of all the Cuban people.
Okay,
of
maybe
the
that's
ocean.
the idea of wealth, right? Because, to me, the way some countries in the world are outrageously wealthy is because they're making other people poor.
Yes.
There's no such thing like exponential growth. It doesn't exist. People like Amazon are it's interesting. We like to celebrate, wealth, but we don't want to look at what creates wealth, that kind of wealth. It has to be balanced, a free market. You cannot put light feathers and heavy, weight in the same basket. They won't be able to compete. That's what they're asking the people from the third world to do. You come with this huge corporation who comes give shitty jobs to the local population just because they give a couple of jobs here and there. They don't pay any taxes. 5 years later, they move the operation to another country to avoid paying 5 years of taxes. But if you don't do that, you are pariah. You are socialist. You are communist. And then the brown and black people all over the world don't have the right to look for sovereignty, to look for dignity. If they do so, they're communists. They have to bomb their butt up.
Well, Cuba did that, I guess, in 1959, right? Or tried to, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. Okay, so let's talk about the future for Cuba. What do you think, Armando?
I mean, I think the future for Cuba is it's not very positive. I mean, unless, again, forgetting about the embargo now, the embargo has to change, but also the internal politics have to change. One person can't be making decisions all the way down the line. There has to be more freedom for people to operate, whether it's politically, business-wise. And again, most of the people coming into the U.S. right now are not political refugees; they're economic refugees.
Yeah.
So fix the economy, then work on the other stuff.
Yeah.
But again, I think that look at the investments. The roads are a mess in the whole island. Having driven across the island several times, it's a mess. Infrastructure, housing.
That's kind of worse, isn't it?
Well, it depends.
I mean, I drove to
I was
Santiago.
in New Jersey.
Yeah, it
I
went
was
so
in
hot.
New Jersey. Wasn't that pleasant?
Yeah, but then
to ride
Cuba's
on the road? Yeah, and then
I grew up in New Jersey, and
yeah.
it's way better than Cuba.
No, I agree with you. But New Jersey and Cuba, it's like light feathers, and hey, across the nation, there's people have hardship. It's
But Cuba's a small island. Can it survive? Is my point.
yeah.
It's got no choice to survive.
I don't know
Well,
that.
The question is, it's going to survive. I mean, what are you going to do? It's going to survive. People will be
Well,
living
there are
there.
countries that aren't surviving, like Haiti, right? Right.
There's Katie may not.
Cuba's not going to be that.
Are you with us?
Nope.
Yes.
All right. So your take on the future of Cuba?
That's not the question he wanted.
He's in Puerto Rico.
I think he wanted something a little lighter.
No. So I was talking to a guy about how bizarre it was that people seemed happy, which didn't mean they were content or
Right.
satisfied. And
Good point.
Yeah.
Good
said,
point.
well, when you have hope and it doesn't come through, you get angry, and we see that in our country, all the
Right.
anger.
That's true.
Doesn't seem to be a lot of hope, and so people, I don't know. That was an interesting way of looking at it.
Do they not?
A despondent. I mean, all we saw was Havana.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
like if you go to the old North End, you're not seeing Vermont. So we're really talking about a period of time, a short period of time, in a small section of a big city. But no, my thing was around the baseball. I couldn't believe all the U.S. coverage was the same, and to me, it was a story of, national Cuban team plays in the United States, plays in Miami, plays in Little Havana.
Wow.
And a couple of hundred people show up to protest, which is, for Burlington, it would be like if 3 or 4 people showed up to protest. Maybe that's high. Maybe it'd be one person. And that's not a news story in Burlington, but there's one place said a couple of dozen protesters slamming the baseball players because they're communist, players. And the story wasn't thousands of people are rooting for the Cuban team inside the stadium.
Was that true? Was that accurate?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, there were people rooting for and against them,
And the majority of people were cheering for the U.S. baseball team. But when you're cheering for the Cuban team, you're recognizing the Cuban government because
Yeah.
they are
They were-
And the other group was saying we hate the baseball players because they're supporting the communists. So, but they were a couple dozen people, but that became the whole story.
See, I was reading the Miami Herald. That was a story in the Miami Herald, but then the other, like the New York Times and stuff, didn't have it, did it, Graham? I didn't see much about the.
I didn't see anything about it.
But
I wanted to.
There was 7 stories that I read. There were 7 stories that I read.
But he is in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, he's in Puerto Rico, right?
And a shitty bullpen catcher who, a bullpen catcher wears a uniform. They're not a player. They don't go into the game. They're a bullpen catcher. They're a step above a ball girl or a ball boy, and they're way below. But a bullpen catcher defected, so that became a big story. Cuban player defects.
Bigger story in Puerto Rico and Miami than the rest of the country, though.
Yeah, probably. I didn't hear anything about it here.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that I get upset about is you don't hear anything about Cuba here. And meanwhile, it has really been, in my mind, a crime against humanity what the United States has done in Cuba. And there's never any news about it here, ever, ever, ever.
But Sandy, friends, what is then the future?
So, Eric, just the last point around
Okay.
what Al said is that, okay, so the Free Press, which is, what was it today, maybe 8 pages or 10 pages?
Yeah, horrible.
They didn't run that. They didn't run that story, but the reason you go down with educators and anyone else, and they're all blown away, is we just get this constant drip. If you would have seen that story, that would have been the line, because that was the only line the U.S. press was covering. It wasn't a story about Cuba. It was a story about U.S. foreign policy through the lens of a baseball game.
Yeah.
Because everything's about politics.
We just get, sucked into it.
The Cubans make it about politics, Graham. That's been their strategy for the last 60 years. Everything is about politics. Everything is
But what
about Cuba.
the future of then the stance of the U.S. towards Cuba?
I think
Can we
the stance
expect
is
any
gonna-
change?
I don't expect any change because briefly we had change from Obama. The reason I think Obama was at least friendly toward Cuba, Obama recognized something that almost no other Americans recognize. Cuba is a largely black country. And Cuba, Obama has sympathy for it.
No, but beyond that, Obama.
Beyond that, it will never. To me, it will never change.
What I saw in Cuba is like Obama brought hope.
Yes.
And then
To
there
all
were
of us.
no,
To
but
all
there
of
were
us.
like some clear,
Advantages.
advantages of people started building new hotels. They were hoping that the situation will get better, and then even the economy was a little
The economy was much better.
yeah.
in
So
Cuba.
there is a correlation.
Yeah.
There is a direct relation between the embargo and the wealth of Cuba. The well-being of Cuba. So if it changes, maybe.
Well, if we see, like, right now we have a trickle of Americans going down there and checking things out. And travel
And we're trying
busts down
all the time to
walls,
increase it.
Travel busts down ignorance.
Yeah.
So if we can build on that trickle and get more and more Americans going down there and seeing the effects of the embargo and things like that, then maybe we can affect positive change for Cuba and the Cuban people. So this trip was wonderful.
Yeah, just on that point out, there was a story I forwarded to you folks today that the amount of dialogue between the two embassies has
Increased.
really picked up significantly. And
Here we go.
the
So
U.S.
hope.
government and the Cuban government were supporting 2 American musicians at the Havana Jazz Fest last month. There were 3 other festivals that had the 2 governments supporting cultural exchange. So they're saying it's the biggest thaw in cultural exchange in 6 years. And
We'll see.
I think it's. I agree.
and
That's
until-
true.
And until the prisoners
Yep.
are released from July of 2021, Biden won't probably do anything about taking them off
Biden
the
won't.
terrorist list.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
But then you know what, Graham? Then they'll come up with another.
I know, they will.
I agree with you.
They'll come up
but
with
anyway,
something else.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you all for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
And we'll be
nice to
back
see
in
you
a
all.
month or so. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to hear everyone's voice.
Come back
Graham,
from
good to hear you.
Graham, when you come back?
first week of April, he thought.
April 4th.
Okay, so then I'll wait for him to come back to have our next CAFS meeting.
Yeah, okay,
As
sure.
opposed, because
Yeah,
Joanne's
sure.
gone too.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
All right, good, Graham.